All righty. Well, hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Monterey Bay Aquarium here, live all across the internet and also on the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute's social media feeds. My name is Patrick. I work at the aquarium here in social media. Joining me from a few miles away in her home, we've got Emily. Emily, how are you doing this afternoon?
A Thursday afternoon tradition right now.
All right. I think Emily, I didn't have you turned on yet, so we can
Oh
start that one
no!
again. Hey Emily, good
Hey
to see you.
Patrick. Hey everyone. Good to see you. Good to hear you right now, Patrick. Thanks everyone for tuning in for our Thursday afternoon tradition as we have another special guest on this afternoon, Patrick.
Yes, we do have a very special guest, and I did want to say hello to Jim Barry of Embari, and I'm going to see if I can pull us up right now, all of us here on the call that we happen to be on. All right, everybody, we are all live here, all at the same time. Go ahead and wave to the camera. Hey, Jim, it's good to see you there.
Hi, Patrick. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for running these. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Oh, we're going to give it a shot. So you can see we've got a whole big crew there up top saying hello. But Jim, I'm going to put you now here in the lower corner um, of the window. Let's see, transitioned there, and I'm going to start playing a few videos here of the Monterey Bay. Actually, before maybe we get started with all of that, I will hide us here, and we'll just give a quick intro about who we are and what we're talking about today. This is Mysteries of the Deep, everybody, and we are talking to some researchers. Today it's Jim from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. You can see here the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute is located at the mouth of the Monterey Submarine Canyon over in Moss Landing, about 20 miles north from the aquarium. Here's a look at what that looks like. There's Monterey, there's Moss Landing, and Santa Cruz across the way from where we are. And underwater out here in our backyard, we're very fortunate to have a really incredible feature of essentially the Grand Canyon underwater here in our backyard. Basically, the canyon is a mile deep with another mile of water stacked on top of it. And what Embari has is many research vessels. Here is the Rachel Carson. And aboard the Rachel Carson is a really awesome piece of technology called the ROV Ventana. An ROV is a remotely operated vehicle, and the ROV Ventana dives down into the deep sea with an HD camera, which allows us to bring you back all of these video clips that I will be sharing with you all this afternoon. Aboard the vessel is the pilot and the scientist, just like Jim, looking at what is going on down there in that deep sea. And so, without further ado, I'm going to see if I can bring all of us back, or at least you, Jim, in the lower corner, and we can start talking a little bit to you about seamounts and mountains beneath the waves. So tell us what's going on there.
Sure. Well, we all have gone for hikes and we see mountains all over the place when we travel, but they occur all over the world, including under the sea. And exactly what is a seamount? Well, basically, it's an underwater mountain or an underwater projection above the seabed. Some might just be a small hill, some might be rugged, huge mountains as big as Mount Everest. But there are roughly, I mean, it's hard to count them because it depends on what you think is a seamount, but there are roughly 20 to 40,000 seamounts at the bottom of the ocean, including some that are right along our coast here. And when you look out at the blue ocean, you think, oh, everything's fine and it's just water and fish and whatever. But instead, there are all kinds of things that live on the seabed, either on the mud, which comprises roughly 70% of our world, the bottom of the ocean, or seamounts. Rocky habitats that occur on some of these include beautiful deep sea corals. And I'm not underwater right now, but if you can see the photo behind me, this is a shot of some rocks on a seamount just off our coast, about 30 or 40 miles southwest of Moss Landing off Point Sur, and you can see some beautiful deep sea corals and yellow Picasso sponges there. And what we have is a time-lapse camera that I can talk about later that's right down there right now documenting one picture per hour for the rest of this year that will give us some idea of what's going on. So today we'll be talking about deep sea corals, and you might think about, well, what's a deep sea coral? And they kind of fall into two categories. In across the world ocean, especially in the Atlantic, which is less acidic than our ocean here, we have lots of sort of mound building or forest building corals that actually create large mounds in which lots of things live, very much like coral reefs in shallow water. On our coast, it's a more acidic ocean. Those don't tend to form here. And we have sea fans and other corals like those you see behind me that create small forests, or they're called coral gardens. And these corals are completely different. Well, not completely different. They're somewhat different than those that we know from shallow water. In shallow water, sunlight bathes coral reefs, and there are microscopic symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae that live in the tissues of shallow water corals, and they photosynthesize just like most marine algae do, and they basically feed the corals. In deep water, all of the corals that I'm talking about live in very deep water, below 200 meters in depth, and all the way down to the base of the Davidson Seamount that we'll talk about today, that's up to 4,000 meters deep. And they don't have any zooxanthellae. They live off of this rain of organic debris that is sinking from the surface that includes organic material or even small phytoplankton that they then capture and use as food. So that's a quick introduction that might get this conversation going.
Oh, thank you for that, Jim. And I'm just going to put up there the map of the Davidson Seamount there behind you. It looks like I need to move you out of the way so we can actually see the Davidson Seamount. In the meantime, can Emily, what kind of questions do we have here so far from the folks at home? And for those of you that are watching, there's Emily up on screen. Emily, what kind of questions do we have here?
We've got lots of people just fascinated by the images that we had up on screen just a moment ago, Jim, where so many people are noticing that it looks almost otherworldly, this, habitat that we're looking at right now, when in reality, most of the living space on Earth happens to be underwater. In fact, it's in the deep sea, isn't it?
That is absolutely correct. And if you think about the Earth, it's roughly 71% ocean, and so most of the surface of the Earth is either the surface of the ocean, or if you go to the bottom, is the bottom of the ocean, including seamounts like we're talking about today. But if you really want to talk about what is the biggest living space on the planet, I've forgotten the number, but most of it is the pelagic waters, the midwaters of the ocean throughout the world ocean, which comprise roughly 90, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's well over 90% of the living space in the world. So it's the ocean is where it's at in terms of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're the real aliens here.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, and so going back to that Davidson Seamount map there, the thing about a lot of animals in the ocean that I think people might be wondering is like, well, do they concentrate in certain areas, or it's a lot of water out there? Are there specific areas where things look a little bit different? And so just below you right now on screen, we've got this big mountain outcrop there out in the middle of blue deep water. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes a seamount so special there for that deep sea life?
Oh, you bet. Well, that's a great map because it shows Monterey Canyon going right into the center of Monterey Bay and some of the other canyons that are coming down off of the continental margin. And then you can see two things. You can see right in the center of the image is Sur Ridge, which is where the photo behind me was taken, that little ridge that you see, which is also a seamount. And Davidson Seamount in the lower left, the depth at the base of that seamount is roughly 4,000 meters. The top of that seamount is roughly 1,570 meters, or let's call it 1,500 meters deep. So it's roughly 4,500, 5,000 feet. A mile below the surface is when you finally get to the top of this seamount. And then you can go another mile below that before you really get to the bottom of the ocean there. And that is an old volcano. And as I understand from Dave Clegg, a volcanologist at Mbari, who has worked extensively on Davidson Seamount, it's roughly 50 million years old in terms of I think that's when things sort of were first developed. And if you want to call it how old was that seamount, it's 50 million years old, about as old as me. And it's what is special about seamounts in one way is it's habitat type. So animals are adapted to live on different habitats, obviously, and things that need to live on rocks, like those corals you see and sponges you see behind me, those require something like a seamount that's a prominence that sticks up above the bottom and has currents that are sufficient to basically sweep free any sediment that happens to be slowly settling down onto the seamount. That provides a spot for a larva from a deep sea coral to land, just like a seed from an oak tree lands or an acorn lands somewhere, and begin life and start to propagate and grow into a juvenile and eventually into a large coral. Now, when you think about corals in shallow water, they grow quite rapidly actually in coral reefs in shallow water. But those corals we're seeing here on the bottom live when they get to be large sized, and they can grow from anywhere from 1 meter tall to even up to 3 meters tall for that pinkish coral that you see behind me that's called a bubblegum coral. Corals live anywhere from centuries to even millennia. And the oldest age for a deep sea coral that I know of has been aged at over 4,000 years old. And those that we see on Davidson Seamount here, and we've used radioisotopes to age some of those with our collaborators, they're several hundred years old, even at a relatively small size. So they're very similar. If you think about the tempo of life in the deep sea, it's slow, very much like the developmental times from some of our old growth forests that you'd see up and down our coastline on land. Kind of wandered a little bit there, Patrick. But
No, that's wonderful. No, talking about wandering, I'm just looking at all the different clips here, and we have you here now with one of those big bubblegum coral that you happened to mention there, filmed at Davidson Seamount. We've got some questions here. Was Davidson Seamount previously over a hotspot? Is a different kind of volcano? That is coming from Emily there, monitoring the group chat there. So, do we know what type of volcano Davidson Seamount was?
Yes, I think we do, and I do not think it was a hotspot. There used to be a spreading center nearby, and although now that we're at a transform fault near where the San Andreas Fault is sliding back and forth along each other, many of those faults that are transform faults sometimes have little breaks in them, jagged right angle turns, and so you can get some small spreading centers in locations. That we don't have a subduction zone anymore along this coast, but at one point there was enough spreading along that transform fault that you created Davidson Seamount. And I believe, I'll give that a 90% confidence in the truth of the factual part of that answer. But to really check it, I'd have to speak with Dave Clegg about that.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I put up a quick little map that I happen to have here in the program of those faults there. So that's great. Maybe I'll go over to Emily. Emily, I'll put you up here on screen if there are any questions that there happen to be.
Yeah, we've had a whole bunch of really fascinating questions coming in right now. Jim, specifically in regards to the Davidson Seamount and other seamounts in the deep sea, over on Twitch, someone was curious about, on land with terrestrial slopes, we always have to be concerned about corrosion, rain, and etc. Eroding away at those slopes and causing problems if there's no plant life to anchor it in place. Since there's no plant life in the deep sea, what is holding these seamounts together? Is it just the type of rock that it's made out of? Is it something else entirely?
Well, that's an excellent question. So what are they made of? And if you think about what's the life of a seamount? Well, first of all, there's some period in which it's growing or being created, and that's ceased roughly 50 million years ago. And it's volcanic. Most seamounts are volcanic, although not all probably. And there are a variety of sort of mountain forming processes that can lead to seamount formation. But I won't go into that because I am far from an expert in that. However, if you think about the things about what this seamount is made of, and it's mostly volcanic, including basalts and also some porous material, but it's all volcanic, then that slowly can erode either through chemical weathering where the rock is actually dissolving a little bit over very long time scales. It can become more solidified. And if you look at some of the rocks in the deep sea, they can actually accrete manganese crusts on them over very long time periods, where they have a black sheen to them because of the manganese crust that forms on them. There are several elements in it, but it's dominated by manganese. Um, at the same time, there are earthquakes that can crack things up, just like the fault zones we have on land. That can end up cracking rocks all over the place, including out at Davidson Seamount, especially if there's some local volcanic activity or earthquake activity. And then in addition to that, there's bioerosion. So animals actually make a living by attaching themselves to it, some cases burrowing into it. So lots of forces can lead to the degradation of the seamount and slowly flatten it out, just like you would at another mountain nearby. Now, one thing that's very different for most seamounts is that we don't have the strong erosive uh, processes like we would on land. So although there's water surrounding it, we don't have rainfall carrying rocky debris down slopes quite as rapidly on seamounts. Those processes can help create, or transport of sediments down canyons can help erode canyons. But for this seamount, they're intact for very long periods of time. And it may be tectonic motions that can lead to their degradation slowly but surely.
Gotcha. That was an
That was a
excellent
great
question.
answer. Yeah.
Yeah,
Long,
excellent.
great question, long answer. Sorry.
No, wonderful, wonderful. So, just very quickly, I've been kind of cycling through a few different animals here. Many of the animals here being corals or other organisms. But we also have this fish here, sea toad. I'd like to play very quickly that I just now found off of Tanny Seamount. I don't know if you have anything to tell us about this wonderful little fish, but I have it up on screen right now. There, we have the sea toad that was discovered, anglerfish relative. You see a lot of different interesting types of fishes surrounding these seamounts, right?
We do. We see, interestingly, the fish are highly patchy around these seamounts. We see fairly high diversity, a number of species, including things like the sea toad that was, I believe you're right, it was on Taney Seamounts, although I think we saw it at Davidson Seamount at one point years ago. But we also see lots of other fish that exploit. I mean, why are the fish there? They're there for feeding, habitat, and reproduction. And feeding might be the real key. And if you think about where food is available for things like this really amazing fish, its prey probably are more abundant in an area like this, and it may be safer against a rock like it's sitting right there right now than it would be out on the mudflat 10 miles distant from the seamount. And if you think about food, where does the food come from for any of these organisms? And they're all animals for the most part, except for the microbial assemblage that's there. Where's the food coming from, and where is the best place to be if you want to be right there where you're ensured a meal today? A lot of it has to do with currents. So all of the food is sinking down from the surface where everything's connected to sunlight. Even though the deep sea, there's lots of life here and it seems distinct from the surface, it depends upon this rain of organic debris that's from organisms growing at the surface, ultimately photosynthesis from algae at the surface that enters the food web and then eventually delivers some sort of food, whether it's a live animal like zooplankton or organic debris that's sweeping by. Now there's a current carrying that food, not just sinking down, but the current is coming across the seamount. And just like you've stood next to a wall, and if you stand just in the right place when the wind's blowing, the wind howls across you. But if you take a few steps behind you and go behind the wall, all of a sudden you're in the calm again. Well, if you're trying to make a living capturing food in that wind by say, whatever it is, let's say you eat butterflies and you're trying to trap butterflies being swept by or other insects, you want to be where those currents or where that wind is pretty strong, out near the edge of that wall. The same thing occurs in near seamounts. A lot of animals will crawl up next to a wall or crawl up at the top of a rock where the currents are a little higher, and then they can exploit those more rapid deliveries of food as they're being swept by. So when you look at those rocks in a seamount, or these rocks that you see in the back of the image there, think about those currents that are kind of sweeping by, and those animals trying to make a living by positioning themselves or growing better where those currents are a little bit higher and food is a little bit more available.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the explanation. I can go to Emily, or also we have Susan and Cassie from Embaria as well. If there happen to be any questions that that you may have seen, we got a few questions here. Emily, how do you?
We've been collecting them in our chat here. There's quite a few that are wonderful. But Jim, we've been talking a lot about these deep sea mounts being formed by volcanoes, even though they are not active volcanoes anymore at the Davidson Seamount. Is the water around there any warmer than the water compared to the rest of the deep sea, or do we find that it's about the same?
Well, that is a fantastic question. And if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would say it's the same temperature as all the water around it, because the heat that is generated around volcanic eruptions and the heat gradient from the rock itself at the outside into the rock is weak. But just about a year and a half ago, there was a discovery of some shimmering water at the base of the Davidson Seamount. And one of the ocean exploration groups through NOAA was having a cruise near the Davidson Seamount, and they were actually looking for an interesting place to go dive with the submarine, the remotely operated vehicle. And Dave Clegg, the guy that I've been mentioning that's a volcanologist, suggested that they go down to the foothills at the base of the Davidson Seamount. And so they did, and they were in their exploration of just looking across the seabed to see what's there, because no one had ever seen it before, which is often true when you go in an ROV and look in the deep sea. They discovered what looked to be some shimmering water. Now, why would you see some sort of shimmering water? It has to do with a change in the density, and you're looking through one clarity of water, and then there's a density change, and it's sort of like looking through a blurry window. And the only way you can get that in the deep sea is either you have a change in salinity where there's fresh water next to salt water, or you have hot water next to cold water. And it turned out that they saw hot water that was emanating from the base of the Davidson Seamount. And the really super interesting biological fact along with that was they discovered brooding deep sea octopuses in these amazing gardens of thousands of nesting octopuses. And I think we have a video that you can show, or at least an image that we can show, of what is now called the Octopus Garden. And this was just an amazing discovery that has to do with heat from the Davidson Seamount.
Yeah, Jim, we have that up on screen right now there, that Octopus's Garden video that you were mentioning. We've got, for those of you looking at home, we've got this, all of these octopuses that are kind of pointing their mouth at us, kind of curled back on themselves. And we've got one octopus in the upper left that's walking around a bit next to a big anemone. Can you describe to us the scene a little bit more? All of those little prickly looking things there, they're sort of purple. Those are the octopuses there.
That's right. These little, I don't know, they look like little Nerf balls in a way, but they're female octopus that are brooding sets of eggs. And the eggs are each about 2 or 3 inches long, and they lay about 20 or 30 of them. And in some cases, you might be able to see them if the video shows it. You may be able to see right next to some of those females a few little eggs that are white. And the individual that's crawling around is probably a male, and we're not quite sure what's going on there, but the male may be looking for a mate. The females are brooding their eggs, and they're all in this, it's hard to see there. I don't think we can see it at all in this video, this blurry, shimmering water. But we have taken temperature probes and looked at the temperature at the base of these octopus. Now, this is at the depth is roughly 10,000 feet. So it's about 3,000 meters, 3,200 meters, I believe. And the water at that temperature is 1.6 degrees centigrade around, just that's what the temperature is at that depth off our coast. Pretty cold. So that's, what's that, around 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or I'm sorry, around what, that 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, each of these octopus is in a little depression, and those depressions are bathed by this water that is either being heated and then flowing by, or it's percolating through this porous rock. And the temperature that we've measured around the octopus, remember I said it's 1.6 outside this area, but it's up to 10 degrees centigrade around these octopus, and mostly around 5 degrees centigrade. So they're living in warmer water. Why would they do that?
That's a really amazing discovery there, and I'm sure many of the folks out there that are watching this right now, Jim, are rediscovering this piece of video footage, because I know that at least for us, it went really, really viral when this first went around there. Those deep sea octopuses, and we did mention in a previous episode the deep sea octopuses that brood their eggs for a very long time. This is a different species, of course, but we'll go back just to show this brooding octopus that is known as Granellodoni there. And so these deep sea octopuses, they have to make a lot of judgment calls on where to lay their eggs and how long to take care of them, or where they lay their eggs, because they're going to be taking care of them for such a long time. That was something that we talked about with Chrissy Hufford earlier. So yet again, these deep sea cephalopods coming upon a little bit of a different way of survival than the shallow water cephalopods that we might be more familiar with, that brood their eggs a little bit of a shorter amount of time. We have them at the aquarium. There's that deep sea Granellodoni there. So I'll bring you back up here on screen there. Jim, if you want to tell us a little bit more about this brooding octopus here. It's very famous now in Mbari and Monterey Bay deep sea lore.
It's very famous in marine science.
Yeah.
It's a really great discovery. And the interesting thing about octopus, in fact, most animals, is if you lay your egg and you brood your egg, especially for octopus, at a certain temperature, and then you have two octopus, one lays their eggs in 10 degrees centigrade, one lays it in 15 degrees centigrade. The warmer the water is, as long as it's tolerable by that species, the faster the development will be for that egg. And you can do that among species. If you look at species that normally live in cold water versus warm water, those that inhabit warm water have shorter brood times for the moms. And you can even take a single species within the lab and have them lay eggs and then brood those eggs at different temperatures. And even within a single species, the warmer it is, the more rapid is the development of those eggs. Now, Bruce Robeson published a paper on this particular female octopus, and he was really lucky in a way, because you can find these octopus, but understanding how long it takes for a deep sea octopus to brood an egg is a difficult thing to know, because you usually don't know when they laid their eggs. But he happened to see that octopus, and it has a characteristic scar on its back, so he could even identify it as the same individual. He happened to see it lay its eggs. And so they went back every year expecting to see the brood period end after a year or two, but it took roughly 4 years. In fact, I think it was 1,574 days or something like that.
Wow.
This immense long period. And that's far longer than most octopus lay their eggs or take to brood. Interestingly, though, if you took a model, if you plotted in logs, you plot the relationship between the brooding temperature and the brood period required, and then predicted, okay, for that temperature, which was roughly 5 degrees centigrade, how long will it take for them to brood their eggs? And it comes out almost exactly what Bruce Robeson found, roughly 1,600 days. So let's transfer back to the octopus garden. They live at an even colder temperature, 1.6 degrees. If you go to that plot with all those species and then predict, based on 1.6 degrees, how long is it going to take for them to brood their eggs? The answer comes out to be roughly 7 to 10 years, I think.
Whoa.
A really long time. So what we think is going on is that those animals are trying to kind of hack the system, if you will, and get their eggs into warmer water so they can shorten that developmental time. And if you think about the advantage of that, there's a huge advantage. Let's say predators are going to get 1% of you per year, 1% of your eggs. Well, that alone says, well, if you can go from 10 years down to 2 years, then you're going to make hay on your egg development.
Wow. So gaming the system there, looking at the graphs and trying to plot their way forward there. That's very, very cool to see that all those different animals figuring out these different things over their evolutionary time, especially just how different it is from the sea surface to the deep sea. All these discoveries that we're making, you wouldn't expect based off the fact that octopuses tend to live such a short amount of time in shallow water that in the deep sea they might be living a very, very long time and brooding their eggs for a lot of that. Thank you so much for that story and the explanation of everything there. I want to go to Emily here because I know that we've had quite a few questions come in here in this time. What are the folks wanting to know?
So, lots of people curious about the octopus. I mean, they capture everyone's imagination. I know that we're definitely blown away by this story right now, Jim. Um, we've talked about octopus previously in the past on our social media channels, and especially about octopus reproduction, how females usually will lay their eggs and then after they hatch they'll pass away. So lots of people wondering if that's the same with these octopus, if it's like other octopus where they're not eating during this entire time, and if so, how can they survive for 7 to 10 years without eating anything?
That's another really excellent question, because if you think about the kind of metabolic requirements for these animals, how do they live a long time? And this species is a species called Moose Octopus robustus. Not that that name means a whole lot, but they're in the same group of animals that of most other octopods that we see in the deep sea. And they do, we think, die after breeding, both the males and the females. In fact, we found some sort of senescing animals, if you will, that sort of they seem kind of out of it. They may be on their way out when we see them, but we haven't actually documented that they die after brooding, although I think other literature may indicate that. Now, there is one risk here. So if you decide, okay, here's a great warm spot, let's lay our eggs here. As long as it's the right temperature, that might be a great way to shorten the brood time and really increase your fitness. How many young can you bring to adulthood? However, if it's variable, if the temperature varies from day to day or season to season, and you're going to be there for a year, you may find yourself in trouble if the water gets too warm. And in fact, there was a discovery of this same species on another cruise off Costa Rica, I believe, and they found many brooding females. They found no developing or hatching larvae. There were eggs there, but none of them were developing. And it may be that it simply got too warm. And we see the opposite. We see eggs at all stages of development, including eggs hatching out and swimming away while we're watching.
Wow. Fascinating. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Sure.
And then,
Yeah, go for it, Emily.
Patrick, just kind of continuing on that topic there, a lot of people have heard about how temperature can change the sex of the hatchling of other animals, such as sea turtles. Is that the same case with octopus?
Boy, that is a really great question. I have not seen any literature related to that, and I certainly don't have an answer for these guys. Um, I, we have not collected that many of the eggs. We did collect some eggs, and we picked up a rock, and we didn't think that we were going to end up disturbing it, but we ended up with some eggs. But we don't really know the answer to that, and it could be that brooding temperature has something to do with sex determination. Hard to know. It's a different group of animals, and my expectation is that sex is determined independent of temperature, but I just don't know the answer.
No, that's a perfectly acceptable answer.
Sure.
Because there's so much that we don't know about the deep sea, and why it is such a fascinating place to study, and why we're so fortunate to have you and all of our friends and colleagues over at Mbari trying to unravel these mysteries. Promise this is going to be the last octopus question, then I'm going to hop over to some of the other many questions about the delightful vertebrates and invertebrates that we've been seeing on the screen here. But we also had the question, are there any developmental disadvantages or advantages of having kind of a sped up development, depending on where these octopus are raising their eggs?
That's another really excellent question that I don't know we have lots of information on, but you can imagine advantages, certainly just the fact that there is a risk to having your eggs on a rock for a long period of time. And we know that the females protect them. And in fact, we saw predation events on the eggs and on the juveniles when they were hatching. There are, amongst those rocks that you saw around those brooding females, there are some small shrimps that we saw attack some of the juveniles as they hatched out. And ultimately, the one juvenile that was really under attack was squirming away, trying to release itself from the grasp of this small shrimp, and eventually did and swam off. But it does give you the impression that there's a risk for being on that rock. And if you can go from, say, 10 years down to 2 years, you then certainly narrow the risk to a shorter period. So that should be a big advantage. On the other hand, what if there are some developmental abnormalities that come along with that increased sort of metabolic rate and the development that occurs more rapidly than maybe it would under other conditions? And we don't know that much about it, other than the extreme, where obviously if you make it too warm, you're going to have calamari rather than juvenile octopi or octopuses, sorry. So if it's too warm, you can simply cook them and mortality would increase. So that's obviously a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, I'll head back to you. I just I'm going to do a hard cut over to a coral that was named after Julie Packard. Let's see. Let me get rid of the Octopus Garden there. Bring this back, and we're back. Yeah. So amazing stuff about deep sea cephalopods, octopuses on those seamounts. I just have a hard cut over here to Packard's treasure coral here, discovered on Taney Seamount. Is there anything else we wanted to mention about corals, hydroids, these cnidarians? Anything that we haven't mentioned yet about those?
Well, I think sure. There's a lot that we don't know about corals, and what's happened so far is that we have started to understand where corals live in the deep sea, and there are some big concerns about conservation of deep sea corals. And I've already mentioned that they grow quite slowly, they live a long time, and they're often positioned in an area where fisheries are abundant. So and this was noticed, and because of that, they're highly vulnerable to fishing disturbance. And this was noticed especially in the 1980s, when many of you may remember the orange roughy fishery, which is still fished off Tasmania and Australia on many seamounts. And trawlers go into seamount areas and use bottom trawls to capture fish, and they destroy deep sea coral gardens at the same time. And they don't come back rapidly. In fact, there's literature now trying to evaluate how rapidly some of these areas that have been almost denuded by deep sea trawling have recovered from those. And the recovery rates after even a decade or more are very, very slow. And in fact, working with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary with Andrew de Vogelaar and Erica Burton and others in NOAA, we're trying to ask the question, what can we do to try and accelerate the recovery of areas that have been damaged? And this includes areas off Monterey. And fortunately for us, most of the seamounts that we have are really rugged. So any trawler that has gone down and tried to fish there has immediately lost their gear through entanglement. So they learned long, long ago not to trawl in some of these areas because it's simply too risky for their gear. But there are other areas where they've trawled that presumably had some coral habitat. And we have tried some simple experiments to take corals, bring them to the surface, put them in some sort of pot, and then move them into an area where we can translocate them or transplant them in hopes that they may live and eventually repopulate those areas. So sort of got off on a sideline, but there's lots that we don't know about corals.
Yeah, no, that. Thank you for mentioning that. I was just showing some Davidson Seamount sea fan coral communities, sponges, and everything, and then here's a video of some trawl marks that were recorded by your team. Those are just the rake marks you can see there in the sand trawling. Basically, the net comes down to the sea floor and just scrapes along the bottom and picks up whatever happens to be there. And so that's why it can be an issue, especially if those corals are important habitat for young fishes or other organisms in their development, or just for the community as a whole there. Yeah, so there's the trawl marks there up on screen. Okay, that was my hard cut to something completely different. Emily, what do the folks want to know? I see a lot of questions about geology, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about geology, but since we're talking corals right now, we also had a question about how deep sea corals have their color, what causes it, since most corals up here, kind of towards the surface, they get their color from zooxanthellae, photosynthesizing, giving them their color. Obviously, the corals down in the deep sea aren't photosynthesizing, so they don't have those zooxanthellae, or do they, Jim?
Well, that's another really excellent question, because one of the most striking features of coral gardens in the deep sea is that they're very colorful. And they do not have zooxanthellae. And so the color does not come from zooxanthellae. But you kind of have to imagine what it's like to, to dive into the deep sea. You know, it's dark, it's cold, it's high pressure. Conditions are really constant in general. There are currents that sweep by. And you see these incredibly colorful animals and colonies. And it's not really known what causes those colors. But my guess is, and in some cases there's been work to document that, is that chemistry comes into play. And while the colors themselves may not be important for their life, although there's some bioluminescence in corals that we don't really understand yet. We haven't even documented it very much. One of our scientists, Steve Haddock, is starting to document bioluminescence in deep sea corals and other animals that are on seamounts here. But chemistry comes into play because there are many predators that want to eat these corals. And one way to defend yourself from predators is to try and keep them off in one way or another, or diminish their ability to consume you. And one way to do that is to produce compounds that are either hard to digest or they're distasteful. And this has not been studied as broadly in deep sea corals as it has in shallow water corals and sponges. But there's actually a fairly large literature showing that there are a variety of novel compounds in deep water sponges and corals that have some sort of bioactivity. And by bioactivity, I mean they either are antimicrobial, or they are distasteful for some predator, or they may play some other deterrence role in protecting them from predation. So that's one reason that they're colorful, I think. But
Wow.
we need more work.
Yes, always. Um, Again, kind of talking corals right now. We had a couple of great questions about, can deep sea corals survive in shallower waters or even in the laboratories? And have we ever tried to breed those deep sea corals in a lab before?
Great question. The answer is sort of yes, and maybe yes. And the sort of yes is we've brought them up and other people have brought them into the lab. Some species of corals do quite well in the lab, at least for some period of time, say on the scale of weeks to months. And Monterey Bay Aquarium in particular is trying to culture deep sea corals so that they could put them on exhibit, perhaps. We have tried to bring them into the lab so that we can try to do some simple experiments with them to try and understand, for example, how sensitive are they to ocean acidification or warming or low oxygen levels. Um, we've had variable success with that, and so we don't have um, a great answer for bringing them into the lab, and we don't have a great recipe for how do you keep a deep sea coral alive in the lab at surface pressures. But it doesn't look like at least the shallower end of this group of animals is it doesn't look like it's impossible to bring them up. As far as breeding in the lab, that might take some research to figure that one out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jim. Just been playing an anthology of corals there in the background. Just I don't know if we mentioned this very quickly. What would you consider a coral versus an anemone, like I have up here on screen? Just for the folks that are looking, if they see deep sea footage in the future, how might they just recognize offhand? Oh, that's a coral. That's going to be a sponge there, and we've got those photos there behind you, just so that the folks know. Okay, that's what we're talking about. The corals are the which ones on screen?
Oh, no, good question. If you see what's something that looks like a tree, branches, it's a colony like those behind me, the pinker types, those are corals, and strictly speaking, there are different types of corals, like the scleractinians versus some other octocorals or gorgonians. Most deep sea corals really belong in the sea fan group. And the sea fans often are sea fans that you'll see in shallow water where they actually look like a flat fan. But in other cases, they look like branched oak trees. On the other hand, anemones don't have that branching structure typically quite as much, while some of those and the sponges, like the bright yellow sponge in the background, those sponges usually have flat surfaces or they're urn shaped. They don't have the same strong branching structure. And I'm not sure that explains it particularly well. But if you want to look at one feature that separates the two, say anemones versus corals, most corals have a calcium carbonate skeleton inside their tissues, whereas anemones typically do not.
There you go. Yeah, thank you. There's just so many beautiful things that have been up on screen there. It can be difficult, I think, for folks to tell. So thank you so much for that explanation. So much life on the deep sea floor, and we're not even mentioning the brittle stars and the feather stars that are there, the crabs and everything crawling all over. So yeah, thank you for that. Emily, I'll go to you. Looks like we got some questions.
Just commenting on the diversity of life that we've had up on screen there, Patrick. I know that we've been focusing a lot on the octopus and the corals, but we've seen some sponges and crabs and other little crustaceans and brittle stars up on screen. Jim, do you have any favorite deep sea seamount occupying animals down there?
Well, sure, I do. It's hard not to fall in love with bubblegum coral, but I'd have to say that maybe bubblegum coral is my favorite, in part because they form these trees that can be 2 to 3 meters tall and undoubtedly several centuries old. And I think of them as little oak forests, really, and they're just so incredibly beautiful. And they'll have different animals that crawl on them, perhaps to get up higher from the bottom so that they can feed more effectively. In other cases, there are symbiotic relationships between some worms that live amongst their tissues. And at the same time, they may have some predators coming after them that they either defend against those, maybe by some other animals that are on them that help keep them away, or by the defensive chemistry in their pink coloration. I'm not sure. So if I had to choose one, that would probably be it.
That's wonderful. And I think right now what I'm going to do is run through some of my favorites, just because I have them loaded up. We got the basket stars on that bubblegum coral that you were just mentioning there. Basket stars are an echinoderm, which is a relative of sea cucumbers, sea stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, you folks may know. And you can see there that basket star with all of those arms. They can sometimes be just wound up in a tight ball, or they can open up those arms extremely wide. So basket stars are really an amazing type of echinoderm. We can see it there on a sponge. But then there's the feather stars that I wanted to mention, because feather stars, Mbari has an amazing, amazing video of these. Also known as crinoids, you'll often find feather star fossils that are very beautifully preserved there. They've been around for a very long time, and they look just like plants sitting there not doing too much, but they can swim. And so, Jim, I just wanted, maybe we can even do a reaction video here. We've got the feather star swimming video that is just truly one of my favorite Mbari videos. I had never thought of what a feather star might look like when it swims, but there it is there off the bottom. Every so often around the internet, these types of videos will go viral. Let's talk a little bit about this swimming feather star here.
Sure. Well, feather stars are crinoids, and they like to get up in an area where they can feed. They make a living by capturing, basically, there's a net that they capture particles, and they often crawl up on top of rocks or on top of other animals, because if you think about the currents that are sweeping by carrying this food, if you're very close to the bottom in between a couple rocks, the currents are really slow, and so there isn't much food going by. But if you can climb up on top of that rock and get to the edge where the currents are really sweeping by, then you can capture more food. Crinoids, or these feather stars, are able to swim. So they can have this beautiful undulating swimming motion that's just mesmerizing. And I think the movie Avatar, which obviously gained some inspiration from deep sea crinoids, um, they they can kind of magically climb up on top of some spot and position themselves in the optimal spot to make a living. So they're not suffering by just wherever they landed as a larva. That's where they're glued to the bottom, and that's where they stay. They're mobile animals.
That's awesome. Sorry to commandeer there the spaceship of our broadcast here to just had to make a hard right over at Feather Star Swimming because we saw that there. Really awesome stuff. Okay, Emily, I'll go to you. I see that we're coming up on just about 7 minutes left here. Thank you so much, Jim, by the way, for all of the knowledge coming in off the top of the head from all the different questions that we have. Emily, we're live with you. What kind of questions do we have here?
Let's hop back to some geology questions if you're up for it, Jim.
You bet.
All right. So, talked a little bit about how an extinct volcano made, or let's go back there. It's
even further back.
We're getting through the day. We talked a little bit about how the Davidson Seamount was created by volcanic activity. Do other deep sea mounts that might still have active volcanoes underneath them, do they ever experience bursts? Do we see that from the surface? And how does that shape the sea floor over time?
There are undersea volcanoes being created right this second, and probably many places around the world. And if you think about hot lava coming out, and hotspots are the thing that really comes to mind, like the Hawaiian Islands. That's where we have a hotspot where islands are being created kind of all the time along these hotspots. The other place that we see creation of new seafloor or hotspots are the spreading zones along say the mid-Atlantic ridge, where new seafloor is being created as tectonic plates part from one another. And along the parts, one of the places that comes to mind the most is Iceland. Iceland is right along the mid-Atlantic ridge. And if you go offshore from Iceland, there are almost certainly some small volcanoes that are creating new seamounts as we speak. And those seamounts, when they're super hot, if larvae land on them, they're going to be cooked. But once it cools, then all of a sudden you have new habitat. It might be risky for a while to land there because you may be covered by new lava on a subsequent eruption, but new habitat that's created on the seafloor in growing seamounts is certainly new real estate for deep sea corals and other animals.
That's awesome. And I've been playing just an anthology of crabs found on the seafloor there at the moment. Something that you would find along the mid-Atlantic ridge in the absence of having footage of the mid-Atlantic ridge here. But we'll just say that there's a few crabs over there, and they're watching those volcanoes grow there, in case you're wondering what was going on with the crabs there in the background. Emily, back to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
any more questions?
This has been one of my favorite questions that has come by. We've talked about amazing animals. We've talked about your favorite animal down there, Jim. But what is the most terrifying creature, in your opinion, that you've seen down there? Or I think the words that I've seen go by, what's the most nightmarish one? And my favorite word that someone used, what's the most eldritch looking creature that you've seen in the deep sea?
The most
Eldritch, kind of ancient, spooky looking.
well, there are most of the animals are just simply fascinating, but the one that kind of gives you this kind of gut wrenching, oh my God, It's got to be hagfish.
Oh, I'll go grab one of those. Hold on. Be right back.
The audible
They're not
reaction from
particularly.
everyone that we're
Here we go. I found
on
it.
the
Nope. It's coming up. There's the hagfish doing their thing.
Now, by
Hagfish.
themselves, they don't look so, they're kind of benign, but they just kind of, they're like the Terminator. They're going to get you eventually, and so they just never stop. Is my view of them, and it's sort of an emotional reaction more than anything else. But that would be it.
And we've got the hagfish
So-
up there on screen
There you
right
go.
now. In case you folks are wondering, hagfish, also known as slime eels, and there's actually a new fishery for those here in the Monterey Bay, out of Moss Landing. There, these slime eels. Myxiniformes is the group of fishes that these hagfish find themselves in. And I gotta say, if you ever have the opportunity to be around hagfish slime, it is something to behold. It is truly an impressive biochemical feat that they're able to do.
Agreed.
And I guess we won't talk to it is just a little bit after lunch, or maybe people are having lunch there in other time zones, so we won't talk too much more about them, I think. Let's see, anything else? Emily, going to you again.
All right.
What do we think?
Another question that we had. So there's so many, so I'm just scrolling through the collection of them that we have going on in our chat right now. This is a popular one for many of our streams. How does the pressure affect the animals living on these seamounts?
Well, for the most part, it probably doesn't affect them that much on sort of day-to-day timescales. They don't feel the pressure because most of these animals are full of liquid. And those that have a swim bladder, some fishes do have swim bladders, they are using that swim bladder to add gas to it or to remove gas from it to regulate their buoyancy so they can go up and down. But for the most part, all of these animals are completely liquid, and the pressure just goes sort of right through them. Now, that said, they're under high pressure, especially at very deep ocean depths. And there are some changes in the shape of proteins that have to do with pressure. And so if you have a particular enzyme, for example, that needs to be exactly the right shape to bind with a particular amino acid for protein synthesis or whatever you're doing in your body, and you add pressure to it, it might change its shape just a little bit, and all of a sudden it wouldn't work. And so there are many, especially in the microbial research community, they've looked at pressure adaptation and organisms, especially microbes, that really require high pressure because they evolved and have been in the deep sea for so long. They actually require high pressure. But for day to day, most of these animals, just pressure is not really something that they feel any stress because of.
Good to know. Yeah, and I tried to play a bunch of different squishy animals there behind you there, Jim. So right now we have a nudibranch, Tritonia hanging out on one of those corals there. And then next one here is going to be a Opisthotuthis flapjack octopus. These are animals that don't have those air pockets like you were mentioning. And so for these animals that we've had on exhibit at the aquarium, temperature and light are really some of the key factors to first figure out to keep them comfortable, and then pressure as an added bonus if they do need that protein folding, but not as bad as the pressure that you may experience when you're diving down there and coming back up. So, and then here is a Dumbo octopus here, another animal not too affected by the pressure until certain chemical processes are slowed down there.
Now, I'll just add one quick comment, and that
Go
is,
for it.
if we want to bring some of these animals up to the surface and have them live in an aquarium that's surface pressure, then they may be adapted to deep pressure, and bringing them up may cause some challenges, either due to this sort of structure of proteins and pressure or some other factor. But pressure can come into play, especially for those animals we bring up to the surface.
Absolutely. Thank you for the correction on that. Okay. I was just looking at the time here. It looks like we are 2 minutes past an hour spent here with you, Jim. So thank you so much. I think what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to bring everybody kind of back into view. Oh, here, I'll undo my camera there. We got Cassie, we got George, we got Susan over there answering everybody's questions. We've got Emily. Thank you so much, everyone, for this amazing live stream. Thank you, Jim, for all of that knowledge there.
Oh, it was really a pleasure. I mean, how can you not be excited by talking about the deep sea?
Yeah, a whole lot of fun. We'll just wave to everybody who's been answering those questions the whole time. They got all of their amazing Zoom backgrounds there set up during that time. Okay, well, with that, everyone, that has been Seamounts and Mysteries of the Deep with Jim. We haven't covered everything, so I'm sure we will be doing another one of these very, very soon. Thank you again, Jim. Thank you to the Mbari crew that's over here on this side for answering all of those questions. Thank you, Emily, down over here for fielding all of those questions live on the show. And yeah, thank you again, Jim, for sharing your knowledge just above Emily there of all those Mysteries of the Deep. Really amazing stuff. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It was great.
Okay, all right, everyone. We will see you again soon. Deep see you again soon here at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute's social media feeds. We're going to transition us back to the title screen, fade out the microphones. Thanks, everyone. Have a great and safe rest of your day.
You too. Give me, I'll try to, if there's going to be a next time, I'll get a microphone so that I can improve that. Yeah.
Nope.
No.
I think.
Yeah.
And Jim, that was amazing. We would love to have you on again. There were so many questions that we were getting that we just didn't have time to get to all of them. So
Good.
yeah, that was great.
Fodder for discussion.
No, awesome.
My message behind me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's better than my son's bedroom. For this, at least.